fine. We're just going to call it the time between 12 and 18, okay? Something like that. Your teenage years. All right. Elkind had a few insights about this and did experiments to elucidate these. So what Elkind was interested in knowing was why teenagers are kind of weird. Okay. I'm going to skip a slide. Why are teenagers like this? Well, like what? There's a few properties of the teenager that are quite strange, and I'm just going to list them here. Elkind went on at length about these. The first is the imaginary audience. Now, when I'm describing these, think to yourself whether or not this was you or people you know when you were a teenager. Okay? So the imaginary audience is this idea that everybody's looking at me. So I always, when I teach this concept, I bring up when I was in a school spirit day and I was walking in front of one of the presentations they were doing, and I was worried everyone was looking at me, and I just remember being very nervous. Of course, probably nobody was looking at me. There was a much more interesting thing happening behind me. However, the teenage mind, self-focused as it is, believes that the audience is always looking at them. This might be the reason why, as a teenager, it took 45 minutes to get ready for school as you tested every outfit combination. Another one is the personal fable. This one really strikes me as just totally true. This is the idea that my life is super different from yours, Mom and Dad, and therefore you can never understand what it's like to be me. This, of course, ignores the fact that every human that's ever lived has gone from infancy to death. And part of that is being a teenager. And so, of course, every human has commonalities at every stage. Your parents were teenagers. They do know what it was like, even if the details aren't exactly the same. Yes, they didn't have cell phones, but they did have friends that were bullies and so forth. This, to the teenager, is a difficult line of reasoning to get off the ground because there's a bias in the teenage mind to think that my life is super different from yours and you can never help me. Okay? So, the third one is called the invincibility illusion. One thing that we need to explain if we're going to understand the teenage years is why teenagers get hurt and die so much, why they take so many risks. It's not just that their brains aren't developed. We'll get to the real reason later. It's not just that their brains aren't developed. After all, infants are far less developed than teenagers, and so are young children, and they're not engaging in the same sorts of risky behavior that teenagers do. The invincibility illusion is really that the statistics of risk don't apply to me. Okay? So a teenager might be able to write a 3-page essay about the statistics of risky driving. And then afterwards, they hand it in, they get an A, and then they go home, they pick their friends up, and they go drag racing. Right? In other words, the statistics don't apply to me, even if I'm smart enough to understand them at this point. That's kind of what the invincibility illusion is all about. So why are they like this? Well, brace yourselves, puberty is coming. Hormones. Hormones are a huge part of the story here. Hormones are always in the human body. Many physiological processes rely on them, but as psychologists, we care about them mostly for their impact on behavior. Here I have the sort of flow chart. Again, follow along on your slides off my camera. I have a kind of flow chart for what happens at puberty. So the major thing to take away from this slide isn't to memorize the whole chart or anything like that, but to realize that there's several hormones that lead to the increase in hormone production that happens at puberty. We probably know what happens at puberty just because we've all went through it, right? Secondary sex characteristics come online, our psychology greatly changes. A lot of this is due to this chart right here happening. So I'm just going to walk you through it real quick. In the hypothalamus, gonadotropin-releasing hormone, one sort of hormone that both males and females have, triggers the release downstream in this chart of two hormones, luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. These together influence the gonads of males and females and basically tells them to produce more testosterone or estrogen. Testosterone in the case of males, estrogen in the case of females. Both males and females have both of those hormones, but males have way more testosterone and females have way more estrogen on average. Okay. what happens is this becomes a runaway process. So this graph is always true in the human body from birth to death, except that at puberty, this becomes a runaway process. The shutoff valve, if you will, for testosterone and estrogen gets broken around puberty, and the body gets flooded with these sex hormones. Okay? So, indeed, the first year of life and the years around puberty have something very in common, and it is hormones. Hormones are critical for development at these two what we call critical periods. A critical period in psychology is something when it is a period in the lifespan where if something doesn't happen, there's going to be a problem. Okay? So if at these two stages there isn't an influx of hormones, there's going to be issues, both biologically and psychologically. Okay, so I just want to, what are hormones? Hormones are these big molecules. They're not like neurotransmitters. They're bigger. And just like neurotransmitters, they kind of fit into cells, okay? It's kind of a lock and key system. And so basically, the lock and key system gets set up around birth, and then all the locks get unlocked around puberty with all that extra hormones that come in. So the hormone receptors here are the lock, and then the keys are the hormones themselves fitting into the lock and changing what the cell is doing, okay? So these shifts cause long-term behavioral and physical consequences. Whereas neurotransmitters tend to change behavior or thought in the moment, hormones change chronic thoughts and chronic behavior patterns, okay? Long-term personality profiles and so forth. And I just want to emphasize, sometimes testosterone gets called the male hormone and estrogen the female hormone. Males have lots of estrogen in them, just not nearly as much as females. Females have testosterone in them, just not nearly as much as most males. Okay? All right. So the two critical stages here then, as I mentioned, are around birth, and it's really the few months before birth until about 6 months afterwards. The borders can be fuzzy. It's just around that time. We're going to call that the perinatal period, around birth. Okay? And at the perinatal period, the term I want to introduce you to is organizational. These hormones set up all the locks. They're organizing the body in one sex-typical way or another. If it's a male, the body gets organized in a male-ish way. If it's a female, the body gets organized in a female-ish way. Lots of overlap between the two, but of course males and females have different lock and key systems in them, different receptor quantities in different parts of the body and brain and so forth. They're not identical. There are more T receptors, testosterone receptors, those locks, in boys put into place around this stage. And there's more E receptors, estrogen receptors, put into place for girls. Okay, so that's what happens around birth. And then around puberty, all those locks get unlocked. So hormones have then, around puberty, what are called activational effects of hormones. So for boys, there's this huge influx from that runaway process I showed you earlier, where all these pre-existing locks now get their keys coming in, which are the new hormones at puberty. Okay, so for boys, lots of testosterone comes in and unlocks the parts of their brain and body that had lots of testosterone receptors in it. And for girls, lots of estrogen comes in and unlocks those receptors in places where there's lots of estrogen receptors. So that's kind of the hormone story. Hormones are critical all through development. They really are the developmental molecules, how I like to talk about them. Excuse me. But that doesn't necessarily explain our initial question. I'm going to go through